Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Navis Nobilite. I am Captain Zelnick, and today we are continuing our ship deployment tutorial. This time we're going to be talking about reasonably common deployment mistakes and how to avoid them. And we're going to start delineating fleets based upon whether they are an aggressive attacking fleet or a defensive, more passive fleet. And this is not talking about scenario roles. We are talking about the very meta of the fleet. And while this can shift depending on who your opponent is, some fleets just kind of fit into an aggressive stance as opposed to a defensive stance. This is kind of obvious when you actually look at the fleets, but broadly speaking, an aggressive fleet is more maneuverable, faster, has more concentrated firepower, but less special weapons. A defensive fleet is going to have significantly less concentrated firepower, slower, but more specialized weapons. So a good example of an aggressive fleet would be Chaos, Eldar, Necrons potentially. Necrons can play either side of that coin. A defensive fleet would be like the Tau or the Imperial Navy. Now, I'm going to be pulling some pieces onto the board here so I can show you some of the more common mistakes uh, of deployment that you should probably trying to avoid. Now, the first one that I'm going to show you is what I like to call the hangnail. And a lot of people do this. It's a little bit sad, but it is what it is. Um, and it's commonly done by people who don't understand the nature of their fleet, if that makes any sense. Actually, I'm going to remove this Mars to make my point, because I can give a couple examples of what's going on. So what I call a hangnail is when you have a defensive fleet and you have this nice little ship formation out here. Everything looks great, everything looks cool, but for some mysterious reason, you deploy ships way off at the edge of, away from the center of your formation. Okay? This area over here, let me zoom in a little bit so you get an idea, a little bit clearer idea of what's going on here. So you have the bulk of your fleet, including your flagship, right over here in this nice, tight, good formation, a nice little phalanx going on. But all the way over here are your carriers. That's a very common thing for people to place their carriers super far away from the rest of their fleet. You have your Nova cannons can be out here. Basically, they're sitting out here all alone. And for a defensive fleet formation, this is typically a very bad idea because allow me to explain. If I were an aggressive fleet and I see this formation beginning to form up, I would be, let me zoom back out again. I would be focusing my deployment strength not directly facing the Emperor or the Lunars over here. All of my fleet is going to be concentrated over here. Okay, up here at the top of the screen, all the way to the right, because my goal is to attack these two ships. These could be any ship, it could be a battleship, so long as it's super isolated from the rest of the fleet. I can get reliably with most attack fleets down here to engage these guys and outside of the optimal range of the rest of their fleet and completely destroy them with very little effort. Okay? Any any fleet, even another Imperial Navy fleet can do this. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever to have your ships isolated in this way if you're functioning as uh, a defensive fleet in this regard. Now, this applies to Tau. People will place protectors and heroes and things like that all the way over here. But, Captain Zelnick, you ask, what about Nova cannons? So, if you're going to have a loose Nova cannon, maybe it's a Dominator, maybe it's uh, an upgraded Lunar or a Tyrant. There is some application to having a far off. Here, let me actually pull one on the board. There is application to having a far off Dominator off to the side to maximize the number of rounds that you will be able to fire your Nova cannons. Now, how would I do this to avoid the problem of this simply being overwhelmed and at the same time outflanking the rest of my fleet? Well, number one, you got to have it here. You have to recognize in your mind that that ship is sacrificial. You are willing to either lose this ship because there's nothing supporting it. Dominators are good, but they're not good enough to protect themselves against the full force of an enemy fleet, or bring a squadron of cheap escorts. Cobras will work just fine, and put it with these guys. So if the enemy does deploy up here in this zone to go and counter this Nova cannon, if you have a squadron of Cobras just sitting here capable of rushing up this way and intercepting the enemy fleet, you will at the very least delay them for one extra round before they get to you, and that will give you time for the rest of your fleet to move in and over to help support the ship. Now, this sort of hangnail situation, okay, is astoundingly common. If you're playing Tau, if you are playing Imperial Navy or any of the Imperial Navy variants, do not try to avoid doing this unless you are fully willing to sacrifice a ship, because doing this will guarantee its destruction if you are facing a skilled player. That is free victory points. Okay? Now, I'm going to clear this off and I'm going to show you a example of something a little bit on the other side of things. So over on the chaos end of things, let's pull out a chaos fleet. This is a little bit more, this is a very different setup, if that makes any sense, because let's not forget that Chaos ships have very varying speed. They vary between 20 and 30, I think 35 is the fastest ship they have. I may be wrong about that off the top of my head, but basically it's a very varied speed, variable speed fleet, because it's meant to be extraordinarily aggressive. Now, in this regard, remembering that we are playing an offensive fleet, we're playing a very fast fleet. So here we have 4 slaughters, we have our despoiler, and we have our repulsive. Okay? Now, a lot of the problems with the usage of a repulsive is in deployment. Players tend to place their repulsive back, alongside typically a despoiler. Well, all of their cruisers, they could be murders, they could be desolators, they could be devastations, they could be a desolator battleship, it could be any cruiser or heavy cruiser, are right up along this line. Now, there is some validity to having your despoiler in the back line because it's your fleet carrier. But recognize that your cruisers are so fast that if you want them to have any kind of support from your carrier, especially a rear line carrier like a Styx or the despoiler, you need to have a way to get your stuff to them. Otherwise, they're going to fly ahead and then get picked apart by enemy carriers and torpedoes. So when it comes to deployment, it's actually important to have your despoiler up front. Yeah, it means your despoiler is going to be sucking some hits, but it's a battleship. It generally can do that. But remember, take your time to get your despoiler into position. Yeah, you're not going to have as much access to those sweet and sexy prow lances because they're super short range. But replace it with torpedoes. It's a far more effective thing, and it turns this into a more aggressive battleship. Now, when it comes to the repulsive is a big problem for a lot of Chaos players. They simply don't understand how to get this ship into combat at the same time as these ships because it's so much slower. Well, the first thing you got to do is remember it has a very important role in the Chaos list, which is its job is to break bigger stuff. Unlike the Desolator battleship, which is designed to break smaller stuff, this is meant to be a second line mop-up crew. But if you want this thing out front, you have to take the risk of putting it on the deployment line and going all ahead full. Now you notice that I'm not talking about concentrated formations here. That's because, broadly speaking, with the exception of 2, maybe 3 ships, Chaos does not need to squadron itself. It doesn't need a strong formation. You can place your slaughters over here and over here with the rest of your fleet right here. Assuming you're facing off against a slower fleet, these guys can get to the center really, really easily. They're not that concerned about the distance because they're so fast. And if you're using murders, they're not necessarily as fast, but the range of their weapons means they can support ships as far away as halfway across the board. So the formation is not that important. Really, it's a matter of where you deploy your specialized ships, like your battleships, like your grand cruisers. That really matters. I will always be an advocate of your repulsive should be up front, center, and thrown at the enemy fleet, or it's going to be offset from the bulk of your fleet. Say you have a fleet deployment, you're going to actually do the reverse hangnail. Your repulsive is all the way over here, far away from the rest of your fleet, so the enemy has to pick, do I dedicate my forces to taking on this zone where the repulsive is, or this zone where the rest of the enemy fleet is? Because when you're the attacker, you have the ability to force your enemy to make hard choices. As a defender, you need to make those hard choices. So bear that in mind. Yes, if this repulsive is out here, you are accepting that it is a sacrificial lamb if they decide to fly the bulk of their fleet this way. This repulsive will not likely survive, but it is so powerful that the enemy simply cannot ignore it. Now, another important thing, don't place it so far to the edge that they can simply ignore it. If I put this guy all the way over here, I will, as an Imperial player, put all my stuff over here because this sucker's going to be plodding along forever trying to get over to this area. So a better position would be, roughly speaking, right here on this line. Okay? This is still able, once it gets across the board, to engage this whole zone. All right? So I hope that was useful in regards to aggressive tactics. I'm going to do my next video based upon Eldar deployment, which is even more advanced. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.